And welcome back, guys. Since so many of you have enjoyed my recent video about Rook endgames, basically elementary Rook endgames, theoretical Rook endgames with 3 versus 3 and the d-pawn, I thought I'd make the next video as soon as possible about the same endgame, just except for the d-pawn, we have the c-pawn in front of us here. And my idea is to kind of go through it alphabetically, well, the other way around, from D, then C, then B, then A, and then at the very end, we are going to have a look at the 4 versus 3. So about this endgame today, I've spent some time now analyzing it and trying to really understand where are the ways that white can try to achieve something and where are the ways that black can try to go wrong somewhere. And honestly, it feels like this endgame is more simple than with the d-pawn. That was kind of my impression now. Of course, it all comes down to where the white rook is placed. This was less important with the d-pawn because, well, with the d-pawn, even if the rook is behind the pawn, which is definitely achievable for white, because the white king can always protect the pawn and then bring the rook behind the pawn. It's not always achievable here because, like, for example, here, if white would try to get the rook behind the pawn immediately with rook b8, black can just play rook c3 and there's no way to get the rook to c1. So this is one thing. I've also tried to get the position and analyze it if white manages to get the rook behind the pawn. We'll get to that in a second. But I've chosen this kind of as a starting position. So let's just say white starts with the move c3. In general, I have the feeling that it's always kind of like this, that especially black really wants to gain space on the king side. So if black can manage to do it, often it's a good idea to play h5 and then g5. Well, here, I guess h5 immediately would be possible. I just thought that now, since c3 has been played, it's typically an even better idea to immediately control the second rank. Why is the rook placed on a3 here nicely? That's maybe a good idea at first. We're going to encounter this idea many times in those rook endgames, also if the pawn is on the b file or on the a file. If it's like this, the rook is placed perfectly on the third rank, because if white would have the option, if the rook is not on the third rank, then white could play king f3. And here it's simply not possible yet. So white would have to take another route via e2, which would be a little bit slower, and the king would not reach the center so quickly. So, I mean, basically speaking, white would need to bring the king anyway to achieve some sort of winning chances. So this is what we're trying to avoid by having the rook on the third rank. So if white could manage the same position, like if black plays, if let's just say we have this exact position, white manages to play king f3. I did not check that yet. Let me just briefly check. But here it could start to get quite dangerous. Yeah, here it's already around +1. So it's important to choose the right starting position. If white could immediately try to get the king, then it can become dangerous for black. So we should always try to avoid that. Of course, especially with the pawn on the second rank, it's a bit trickier because we don't have counterplay on the f pawn. Like if this pawn is already on c4, and let's just say white even gets this position with king f3, I would imagine it would be a little bit simpler still because we have the rook on the second rank. But also here, white's king is quite fast. We would need the king on e6 already here to be in a better position with black. Here it's already lost again for black because the king is reaching the queen side so far, so quickly. Let me just quickly show you, but just because it's quite interesting. After king f6 here, it seems like the only white winning move that's actually very instructive is the move rook to e8, cutting off the black king, and now white is ready to march to the queen side with the king. For example, if rook c2, now king d3, another important move. Rook takes f2 and now c5. Why don't we just go to d4 with the king? Because now after rook takes f2, if c5 comes, the rook can get behind the pawn later on. So here we will pick up the pawn first, c6, and now rook c2. And here it seems like in the end the race is, black is fine in this race. Just watch out for not going here and stepping into rook c5, even though now I'm seeing even this is a draw, because in the end you can sacrifice the rook and black is in time. But if, of course, we have the choice not to allow any of this, we would like to. And obviously, in this line, king d3 was winning because now the king controls the c2 square. And I think now it's a little bit simpler. For example, if rook h2, c6, black is not even really in time to stop the pawn, and black's play, even if he can sacrifice the rook, is going to be much slower. So that was quite a nice instructive moment here. Rook e8, a very nice winning move for white. So already this position was quite difficult. It seems like rook a3 check is the only way to put up resistance, and king e4 f5 the only move, so that the king, if the king goes, then we will have some play with rook a2, but already extremely difficult here. I mean, if I would be sitting over the board, I mean, now already it's lost after rook takes f2. Rook d2 check, only move to hold the draw here, yeah. So we don't want to allow that if possible, yeah. So if we get this position, it's important to stay on the third rank with the rook. That's kind of my main message here. And if white has the chance to bring the king immediately, then he should choose that. So that's why in the starting position, I've analyzed the move c3 with the idea of bringing the king now. So all of this goes back to that black even knows this defensive setup to put the rook to the third rank, which is quite important to mention at the start, actually. So after c3, now rook a2 is a good defensive method now that the second rank has been weakened. For example, if king f3, we can just place the rook behind the pawn, and it feels like this is kind of an easier draw for black to achieve. For example, if h4, now h5, this is typically for the defending side quite a good setup as well. And I would only like you to remember here that black does need to act sort of fast in this position, which is that here both f6 or king f6 are the ways to hold the draw. I would prefer the move f6 actually, just because in those endgames my understanding was always to push for f6 g5, that this is kind of the most precise way to hold most of those endgames, but also the idea of king f6 followed by g5 is quite a typical idea, even though that does not always work, which I'm going to show you in a second. Also, one idea of king f6 is just to bring the king. For example, one line here was f3, preparing to bring the king. King e5, rook c5 check, just king d6, and the king stays close to the pawn, which is manageable here since the pawn is not so far away from the king side. Whenever king d3 comes, now rook g2, and black has enough counterplay to hold the draw. f6, however, was also pretty decent at this point. If rook c7, it's just important not to go to the last rank, but instead to h6, and our idea is to push g5 as quickly as possible. For example, c4, g5, and black just has enough counterplay. Whenever c5 comes, then black can also go after the h4 pawn. So, for example, going rook c4 at a timely manner, or taking on h4 and then going rook to c4. Yeah, another try I had here was f4, trying to bring the king and then sacrificing the g3 pawn, not the f2 pawn. But here, black is just in time with g5. It was also not the only move in this position already. A couple of things were working, but this seemed like the cleanest. So what was next? What did I want to show you? Yeah, just the position. Like, of course, those moves were not perfect now, but I wanted to show you this position. If if white would have the rook behind the pawn, since this is also a scenario which could occur. Now, first of all, if we see this position right here, rook c4 is actually a mistake, which I thought was interesting. I guess that, I mean, I would see the position that whenever white goes rook c2, anyway, I have to go rook c4, so it doesn't really matter when I play it. But that does not seem to be the case when it's the c pawn. In fact, it's black's best chance to immediately bring the king, and not to try to stop the c pawn with the rook, but instead with the king, actually, in many cases. Unless the pawn is reaching the 6th rank, for example, then we can try to stop it with the rook and then try to collect it. Also to activate the king, like king f3, king e5, king e3, h5, h4, and now a very important move, f6, trying to get counterplay immediately with the move g5. If white goes for rook c2, again, rook c4 would be a mistake, but black should really prioritize the king activity here. King e5, I analyzed the following line, c4, king d4, c5, rook a7, c6, rook c7, and here it seemed like black was just in time in the end, just because of the move f6. Going into the pawn endgame here would not be sufficient, because here white has this winning plan of going f4, f5 at the right time. Let me actually think how exactly it was. Maybe g4, king f6, f4, and if king g8, now h4, king f8, and h5. That should be the way how to win, and then black is going to end up in Zugzwang, and we would not king f6 but f6 would win the pawn on f7. That's already quite difficult, yeah. f6, so that's why we need to play f6 so that we can prepare to take on c6, and then king e5 is not possible. If h4, now h5, another important move, but now it becomes obvious that it will be a draw. Just taking on c6 again does not work, because in the end white can play h5 and then collects all of the pawns on the king side. But after h5, now black is ready to take on c6, and then it's a draw. Maybe I also missed a simpler way of holding it here. Now that I think about it, maybe king d6 is also possible, and king f3, king c5, just really trying to stop the pawn with the king, as I've mentioned earlier. And if king e4, maybe I can just defend on the 6th rank with this. Actually, I apologize for that. It does seem like stopping the pawn with the king, if it's a c pawn, does seem like a much easier way of holding it now that I see it here. But I was curious about rook c4, now rook c2, and here black again has only one way to even have chances to save the draw, which is immediately to bring the king. And in this position, I'm actually not sure if black is still in time to hold this, since the pawn is still on c3 and black does not have checks on the 3rd rank, so white could try to penetrate on the 7th rank at some point. So this is a really close call if the pawn is still on c3, but still black does have some chances to hold this position if his king is already so active. But I was curious, if black just goes h5, it just seems like the position is completely lost at the moment. If white goes king f3, here it's important. If we would have this position with the pawn on h4, now it's a draw because black gets sufficient counterplay by going g5 immediately. And if here, then black could take on h4. This endgame seems to me like it's very concrete. Like also here, if it was this position with white to move and he can play king e3, could already be quite risky. I mean, at least if white gets another move, king d3. Maybe black is still in time with the move g5 here. Objectively speaking, it does seem like it. I'm having the computer open just for safety, not to say anything wrong, and that you will then make some mistakes in the game and blame it on me. I don't want that to happen, just because those endgames are so important and they can arise pretty often in our games. So it does seem like this still holds a draw. I'm actually curious if king d3, rook g4 only move to hold a draw. And again, I would think that the king is probably in time to stop the pawn. Yeah, king e8, and then we just go there and it's a draw. But it's imperative for black to immediately start the counterplay. If you get this type of position, f6 and g5 is absolutely important. Now, let me see if we have this position here. Now it's already lost because we don't have the counterplay on the h4 pawn. So now f6 followed by g5 doesn't actually do anything. White can just run with the king and white is winning. So here h4 would be a terrible mistake, but instead white can just bring the king. And yeah, like this, we again reach a very similar position like earlier, just with an even better version for white, because here he has the move rook to a2. And black does not get rook a4. And I was actually quite surprised. This position now is, objectively speaking, completely lost. Still not so easy to actually convert this. But now white can choose when he wants to play c4. I don't know what black can do. For example, if rook e7, I guess c4 now, king c5, maybe rook a5, I guess king c6. And it does seem like a good idea to now bring the rook to f6 in those positions, just to always hit the pawn on f7. And now it seems like actually one way to win is to just run over the king. That's another thing I've learned. I'm learning so many things while analyzing those rook endgames, like here king g5, king e5, and even a move like rook f4. And king g7, king h6, king g7 is coming, and white and black doesn't have any defense against that. That's also extremely instructive. So as I said, this endgame is incredibly concrete. Now let's go to another example, which I thought was important to mention. Yeah, I was clicking around a little bit if we get this type of pawn formation, which could also happen. You never know how you're going to reach this this type of endgame. I guess the most common one is with h4 and h5, but I was also curious if we have this pawn formation. Now, I was making some moves here, just, okay, of course, black should play rook c2 here, keep the rook behind the pawn, but I was curious if white manages to get this type of position here with the rook on f5, which at first looks quite risky for black, because now the rook on f5 is kind of untouchable, and if white manages to get some things, like f3, exchanging this pawn on h2 and bring the king over, then it might very well be lost. But for example, if f6, now actually king f1 does look like a quite reasonable try. I guess still h5, h3. And we can go for that. Maybe also h4 might be even more precise here. That's what I would be thinking of, just so that the pawn on h3 is a weakness. For example, if this, I would be thinking that here. I might have counterplay with rook h2, but now I see that actually c6 is breaking through. So here I would probably need to go for this, and then again try to bring over the king. So one lesson which we learned is that with the c-pawn, it's very often a defensive method to also bring our king to the queen side. This is not a typical thing with the b-pawn or with the a-pawn, because with the a-pawn, often you just say, okay, I don't care anymore about the queen side. Anyway, I will sacrifice my rook at some point if the king runs over. But then if white has the pawn on the a-file, we'll of course get to that in another video, then also white's king needs to be much further away from the king side, so therefore black's chances increase by quite a huge margin if he collects 1 or 2 pawns on the king side and then sacrifices the rook for the a or for the b pawn, just because white's king is so far away from the king side. I hope that all of that sort of made sense, but that's quite a nice lesson, which also I think I have learned, that in those endgames with the c-pawn, you almost always try to bring your king to the pawn to help save the game. Anyway, I was curious about one specific position. So here, of course, h5 would be quite a nice way to just make a draw immediately. If h3, rook c2. Another important lesson is that we, of course, in all of those endgames want to exchange as many pawns as possible. Of course, there are a couple of traits which can be bad, but that does typically involve black's pawn structure getting broken. So this is kind of the only exception. But for example, here, white would need to play h4 or f4, otherwise he would get checkmated with h4. And here we could just trade all of the pawns, and then the draw gets simply much easier because, yeah, white simply doesn't have that many pawns left, and yeah. So, but I was curious here, after h3, h4, now one losing move, try to find the losing move. It would be the move rook c3. I guess that almost all of other moves would be a draw. Of course, the same applies for rook c4 and rook c1. That would also be losing. But it's just about keeping the king cut off here. Because now the king would just run over the queen side, and there's nothing that black can do. Also, it might be quite bad that black still has the pawn, that the h pawns are still there. Because if we imagine that black somehow gets the c pawn, but the f6 pawn is dropping, then immediately after that the h6 pawn would be dropping as well. So that also does explain that even this exact endgame, now it's a draw because of the inclusion of the h-pawns. Actually, let me show just briefly. I guess that here black just tries to bring over the king. I guess rook c4, king d3, let's say rook c1, king d4, and here only move rook c2. We need to cut off white's king from the queen side, rook c2, and here I don't really see a great way for white to continue. So now actually let's go back to this exact endgame. Now how exactly does white win here? King e2. Let's try to apply the same defensive method. King d4, rook c2. Now it seems like f4 is the right way to proceed from here on. f4. What happens if I just wait, take, and now rook e5, having the e5 square available. Of course, taking with the h-pawn would have the downside that at some moment white could, for example, try rook h2 and then h6, trying to push the pawn. So what happens if black takes here, takes on f4, rook takes f4, now rook c1, and well, rook e4 check. Now we can now we can harass the king. So this seems like the only difference, that here white still has f4, and if white takes, then the h6 pawn is still there, which of course is worse for black, because in some cases white could activate the rook and try to go after the pawn, or even there could be an idea of king e4, king f5, king g6. So the same endgame without h-pawns being there, I would assume to be a draw. I hope that all of this is not getting too confusing. I will try to wrap it up quickly just because it's so much information coming in now. Let me just think if there were other positions which I thought were worth pointing out. This we already went over, that here, of course, f6 is always the plan I would like to go for, but also bringing the king, which is quite a typical thing for the c-pawn, 3 versus 3 c-pawn endgame, is enough to save the draw. So where else were we? For example, here, after rook a2, king e3, yeah, we had that already. Rook e8, very nice way of winning for white to cut off the king. That's also great to repeat. Now let's go to our main line. So after h4, I had h5. I think this is quite a natural move for black to make. Otherwise, white could even think about going g4. Like if black continues waiting somehow like h6, maybe it could be an idea for white to go g4, then f3, king g3, and yeah, kind of take it from there. I also wanted to show you, apologies for that, I wanted to show you another, the trade of pawns, which I mentioned earlier. Let me just think, where was that? It wasn't here. It wasn't this exact endgame. It was the same without the g pawn and the h pawn. Let me just put it on the board like this. So if white manages to get something like this, then it would be lost. This is the only thing I wanted to show, because now, again, white can play f3, bring the king over, and since there is still the g pawn and the h pawn on the board, this, again, favors the attacking side. So now if black's king would also run over, then the pawn on h6 would drop off, and that would mean another pawn would be lost for the black side. Actually, I'm curious here that in this position, rook c3 was still the only way to hold a draw. And I think that the point is actually quite beautiful, because after f3, now you can try to find the way to make the draw here from the black side. If white manages to get king g3 on the next move, then it's losing already. So what would be in black's interest, of course, to exchange pawns. So h5 is a very beautiful move here, because you cannot take with the pawn since the rook on f5 is hanging, and black would even be winning. And after rook h5, now we can exchange one pair of pawns. Rook takes f3, and then it should be a draw. Also now the king is cut off and cannot come back, just rook c3, and it's quite simple. And yeah, the same applies if black can take on the next move. For example, if king g3, take here. Again, now it's a draw, because there are only 3 pawns in total left on the board. That's actually quite cool, quite a cool exercise here. Only one move for black to make a draw, which is rook c3, cutting off the king, and if f3, then h5. That's pretty nice. Anyway, I wanted to go back to my main line, which is if white goes h4, h5, and in this specific position, again, if white pushes this pawn to c4, still king f3 is no idea, so we can just go rook c3, and if king f1, another nice move, not that it's important objectively speaking, but I think it makes it much easier to hold, rook c2, again, trying to cut off the king from entering the center. And if c5, again, I would prefer the move f6 because it's kind of a clear plan to push c5. Computer also says that bringing the king, again, just because of this specific endgame, bringing the king always is enough for a draw as well. If king f1, now again, I like the solution f6 the most. Again, the computer says that bringing the king is fine too, but I think that this is the easiest to remember, just going f6 followed by g5. For example, king e2, now g5. And white always needs to cope with this weakness on h4. If, for example, he tries to push the pawn here in this position, then we can just take and go rook h3, and we're picking up the pawn, and it's an easy draw. If white goes, for example, rook c4, guarding the pawn on h4, again, just be careful that you don't get a structure like this, because now, again, it could be very easily lost, because the rook can just stay here on f4 and protect everything, and white's king can run over to the king side to the queen side without worrying about his king side. But something like king g6, for example, is quite simple. And yeah, now what does white do? If king d2 comes, we always have rook f3 hitting the pawn on f2, and otherwise there's no real way to make advancements. One nice trick in some positions could be something like this, for example, because if black is not careful and just makes like a 0 move, let's make that, Control Alt 0, then h takes g5 again would be winning, because black would need to take with the king, and then white can again try to put the rook to f4 and then push c4 and so on. Of course, I should also mention that in those positions, whenever white takes on g5, of course, we want to take with the f-pawn. I guess that has become quite clear now. And then we will always have counterplay with this h-pawn, which can sometimes we can get h4, especially if white goes rook c8, c4, c5, then at some moment h4 is going to come. Yeah, so to summarize this video, I wanted to show you one final example, actually, which is this one. So here the rook is next to the pawn. I thought this was quite instructive to end the video. Black has only 2 moves to save the draw here. They're basically similar, but you can try to stop the video and have a small think if you wish. I will tell you what are the 2 moves now. It's either rook a8 or rook b8, which I guess looks extremely logical at first. It's not so difficult to find. You want to activate the rook behind the pawn. But it's not only about that. it's also, let me actually rephrase the question. If white plays king g2 here, which would be the move you would like to make? Well, here black only has one way to save the game. Now rook to a3. This is exactly what we've been talking about earlier, that we always should deny the access for white's king towards the center. And this is exactly what rook a3 is doing, stopping king f3. And this is the only move to make a draw here. If black does something slow like king f8, then white would simply bring the king, and yeah, here it's objectively winning because white can immediately activate the king. Also, black's king is going to be cut off, so he cannot really go close to the c-pawn because he cannot go further than the e-file. But after rook a3, just as an example, if c6 comes, we can go rook to d6, rook to c3, and rook d6, for example, king f8, king d6 would be a draw immediately because white cannot even hold on to the c6 pawn. Yeah, what else can white try? If, for example, king to f1, I would even be thinking about going rook a2 again with the same idea, denying access, and if king e1. Now rook c2, king d1 would actually come, so now it would probably be time to bring the king. But now I don't really see how white can make progress. So the most important thing I would actually take away also myself is that with the c-pawn endgame, let's just imagine that white's rook is here in front of the pawn. In this type of endgame with the c-pawn, black's plan of defending often involves bringing the king to the queen side. As I said earlier, this I believe has mostly to do with the fact that with the c-pawn, it's not so far away from the king side. So therefore, black can allow himself to go a bit closer to that because it's still not so far away from the king side. So he can always kind of come back to protect all of the pawns. Later on, we will see with the b and a pawns. Now, I hope I'll not spoiler too much or even spread misinformation because I haven't checked that so much yet. Typically, the black plan does not involve to bring the king over the queen side there, just because it's simply too far away. So what we can already learn from our first two videos is that with the d-pawn and with the c-pawn, it's still kind of in the range so that black's king can go over there and help to stop white's pawn. If we go over one or two more ranks, then it might become different. And of course, the important rule, which we've also seen here, is that whenever you have the chance from the defending side to cut off white's king from going to the center, then you should definitely do that. From the white side, what are the best ways to try this endgame? It's quite difficult for me to say because, well, if you're analyzing this endgame, especially with a computer, he's never really that impressed. I think that keeping the rook in front of the pawn is probably the most you will get out of in most cases. Of course, if you can get the rook next to the pawn and or even behind the pawn, well, behind the pawn it's always the best. Then you should probably take that chance. Also, if you still have the pawn on c2, that's quite important. We spoke about it at the start. Then I would urge you not to move it immediately if you can, because in some cases it can be beneficial to still have the pawn on the second or even on the third or even fourth rank. But if it's already so far ahead, then it might even become easier for black to get counterplay himself with the king. And then the pawn could easily get lost, for example. If we have this exact position with now the king on e6, the pawn on c5 would immediately get lost. This would be more difficult to achieve if white's pawn is still a bit further behind. Also, always if you're from the attacking side, you often want to set up some position like this, where you have the rook on the fifth rank and it's sort of stabilized here. That would be quite nice if black's pawn is on f6, for example, already, because then he doesn't have g6 anymore to get rid of the rook on f5. So I guess that this video is already pretty long. Yeah, 28 minutes, that's way too much. I still hope that it was sort of instructive and that you managed to get something out of it. That's the most important thing for me. So hope you guys enjoyed it. If you want to see more from me, you can check out my socials. It's linked in the video description down below. You can check out my Instagram, Twitter, even though I'm posting not so much there, but definitely check out my website. You can also find some courses of me, which I've did in the past, all in the video description down below. Apart from that, thank you guys for watching. The next video is maybe still dropping before the World Cup. I will have to see about that. But anyway, see you guys soon, and thank you guys for watching.